I now have the pleasure, the distinct honor, of introducing Bob Herbert, who without doubt is one of the most significant voices of his generation for the difficult work of reconciling the American ideal with America's reality. Over the last decade, Bob Herbert must have often felt like Isaiah, that Old Testament prophet, more than half of whose books are full of portents of doom, delivered to the oblivious, indifferent Israelites. Like Isaiah, Herbert, writing in his biweekly column in the New York Times, frequently has been the lone voice in the wilderness. In the wake of 9/11 and against tremendous popular support for the war in Iraq, Bob Herbert vehemently opposed the invasion. He decried the fallout from the subprime mortgage crisis before it became regular fodder on the nightly news. He chastised the nation over the unraveling of our democratic institutions and the massive shift of wealth from the middle class and the poor to the rich. And before the fiscal crisis, he warned that, quote, entrenched economic and social problems would undermine the United States for years to come. No one wanted to hear any of this when the Dow was at 15,000 and gas-guzzling Hummers ruled the roads of a new gilded age. But Bob Herbert stuck to his guns and never stopped speaking truth to power, shining a light on the plight of the poor and showing how we had fallen from our national ideals. As one writer put it, Herbert, quote, stuck with the sane minority, even as the majority embraced insane illusions. Herbert was born in Brooklyn in 1945, but he was raised in Montclair, New Jersey, where his family owned an upholstery shop and was, by his own account, quote, a working-class family with a middle-class sensibility. During his youth, he was mostly sheltered from the racial prejudice of the time in Montclair, New Jersey, where he attended a predominantly white parochial school, and he recalled that it was a surprisingly integrated town. But no black man in America of that era could avoid racism for long. Herbert ran smack up against it when he was drafted into the Army in 1965. He said it was traumatic, particularly when coupled with the bitter winter cold of Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. But there was one lucky break. Herbert was stationed in Korea and not sent to Vietnam, and the fallout for friends who did, however, provided grist for one of his most poignant columns. Probably his most famous column, however, focused on a rogue cop in Tulia, Texas, who sent half of the town's black male population to jail on trumped-up drug charges. That one captured the Justice Department's attention and got redress for the victims. That one column was symbolic of the quiet effectiveness that a Herbert column can have. His columns moved Americans to outrage over the suppression of black votes in Florida and over the extraordinary rendition of Meher Arar, a Syrian Canadian who was arrested during a stopover in New York when he was on his way home to Canada. The U.S. suspected him of being a member of al-Qaeda and deported him to Syria, where he was held for over a year and tortured. Herbert traveled to Canada after his release to find Arar, quote, a quiet family man who found himself sucked into a vortex of incompetence, hysteria, and so-called war on terror that has gone completely haywire, unquote. Now, the madness of war, any kind of war, wouldn't be lost on a man who served his country, and those feelings would eventually translate themselves into print. After his military duty and a couple of years working in his family's business, Herbert thought about a writing career. He cold called the Newark Star-Ledger for advice and was offered a job. After a few years, he quickly moved on to the New York Daily News, where he became a City Hall bureau chief and then a columnist. He continued writing his column at the same time he worked as a national correspondent for NBC News. In 1993, Hal Raines, the New York Times editorial page director, hired Herbert to write for the Times op-ed page. Now, at the Times, Herbert consistently writes about issues that matter most, yet seem to be covered least. He decries our yen for entertainment over tough truths, our attention spans too short to wrestle with important and complex matters. His profound insight continues to distinguish the Times op-ed page when other papers have turned indifference into a new art form. Now, like his favorite playwright Arthur Miller, Herbert's columns seem fueled by a strong sense that Americans need to be reminded that they have a moral responsibility, not only as individuals, but as a society as a whole. Quote, "My criticism of any administration," Herbert has said, "is based on a tremendous love of this country and unwillingness to see it damaged without raising my voice in opposition," unquote. Herbert has never hushed his voice. He has spoken out on unpopular social and political themes when it took courage to do so. He remains the conscience of a nation trying to find its way. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and to present Bob Herbert, a reporter, a columnist, whose overall distinction and fearless truth-telling have made him this year's recipient of the Ridenauer Courage Prize. Bob?